Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Campus Compact National Webinar Series. I'm J.R. Jameson, the Executive Director of Indiana Campus Compact and the host of today's session. Before we begin as a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from in the chat. I am participating from Muncie, Indiana, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people of the Miami Nation. Many other tribes such as Kickapoo, Shawnee, and the Pokogan Band of the Potawatomi also called this area home. The region has long been a center for indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, the Miami Nation of Indiana still resides in this area, although unfortunately, despite multiple efforts throughout many years and generations, the U.S. Congress does not recognize the nation as separate from the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. However, members of the tribe continue to live here, contribute to the life of Indiana, and celebrate their heritage and traditions right here where I sit, in the Miami Nation of Indiana. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. We commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. Today's webinar, Avoiding Microaggressions Within Service Learning and Community Engaged Learning, is brought to you by Kirsten Case-Fuller, Julie Dierberger, and Dr. Latrina Parker Hall. Kirsten Case-Fuller is the Community Liaison of the Service Learning Academy at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She serves as the lead liaison between the Academy and community partners, focusing on creating meaningful opportunities to meet community-identified needs through service learning projects. Additionally, she provides support to the development and execution of service learning projects, as well as training and one-on-one coaching for faculty. Kirsten has over 25 years of experience working with the nonprofit community, with 19 of those years focused on community engagement and 12 in nonprofit leadership. Her career has spanned from serving as the executive director for an area adult literacy organization to addressing community-identified issues through citizen engagement. Her role as chief service officer for the city of Omaha, Kirsten helped craft Omaha's first citywide service plan and represented Omaha through the National Cities of Service Initiative, funded through the Rockefeller Foundation. Julie Dierberger is the Paul Sather Distinguished Director of the Service Learning Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She has developed service learning experiences in various professional capacities at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Midland Lutheran College, and in her current and previous position as the P-16 coordinator at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Her research and scholarship focus on professional development, student learning, and partnership development in experiential context. Julie received her MA in Educational Administration and BA in English from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is currently pursuing her PhD in Educational Leadership. Dr. Latrina D. Parker Hall is the P-16 Initiative Coordinator in the Service Learning Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where she supports pre-K through 12th grade teachers and UNO faculty in creating valuable service learning opportunities for their students. She earned her doctorate in Higher Education Administration at St. Louis University, where her research interests included Black family culture, racial and ethnic identity, and student development. She's a proud product of Omaha Public Schools and graduated from Omaha North High School before moving on to earn her bachelor's and master's degrees from UNO. Currently, Dr. Parker Hall is a participant in the Engaged Scholars Initiative, the inaugural cohort of Midwest Engaged Scholars facilitated by the Campus Compact Midwest region. And she is extremely passionate about serving others, especially supporting and nurturing youth development. Before I hand the session over to our presenters, I want to invite the audience to submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screens. Please do not use the regular chat box for questions, as it will not be monitored by the presenters or me during the session. So please use the official Q&A chat box and the questions will be addressed at the end. On behalf of Campus Compact, thank you again for registering for today's session, and I'll now turn it over to the presenters.
Thanks so much, JR. And thanks all for being here and allowing us to have this opportunity to share with you today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right, so that was a very warm welcome and introduction. So I don't have to share much about us because you just heard a little bit about us. So we'll get started with the topic today. We want to talk to you about avoiding microaggressions within service learning and community engaged learning. And from, we'll come from our vantage point and working in the Service Learning Academy at UNO. One thing that we think is very important to do is to note that there have been some phenomenal collaborators in this work. And so you'll see those folks on the screen, Cynthia Ganote, Tasha Souza, and Floyd Chung, who have really contributed to some of the information and resources we'll be sharing today. We usually do a land acknowledgement. So JR, I really appreciate the one you provided, as well as that context. So what I'll do is share our specific land acknowledgement that's specific to the Nebraska area where we are from. And I encourage, I saw one person put theirs in the chat. I encourage folks as a way for us to know who all is in this space with us and for an opportunity, give you an opportunity to share your land acknowledgements as well. And I think my co-presenter Kirsten will share a link to a website where you can go that will help you to shape a land acknowledgement for the area or region you're in. So as such, we first recognize that we are guests living on lands represented by Native nations whose sovereignty, governance, and treaty lands existed long before the state of Nebraska. These nations include the Omaha, Ponca, Santee, Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago, Lakota, Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Meskwaki, Oto, Missouri, Iowa, Kaw, Wichita, Kickapoo, and Delaware nations. So we'll get started with the goals. It's our hope that today will really provide some insight and some resources and information that will help you identify what is a microaggression and really be able to put some language to what that is and what that experience could be for other folks or for yourselves, as well as understanding how white supremacy and implicit bias really contribute to microaggressions. And in understanding those contributions and what microaggressions are, we'll share some micro-resistance strategies so that when you're in those service learning and community engagement spaces, you can identify them as well as employ these strategies to remedy those situations. And then we also hope that you'll be able to gain some insight into how to develop efforts to address implicit bias and microaggressions within service learning and community engaged work. So one thing that's really important for us is to kind of share our journey and how we got here. You know, as we bring partners together in our work and work with faculty, partners, and students, we experience hearing faculty members and partners share microaggressions, and we realize there's a need to really upskill and some resources that can help students for this kind of expose faculty members and partners to the work and how to identify and address microaggressions that were happening. As folks witness statements and behaviors that really provided us examples to be able to put language to these experiences and work to understand them better. So as we present this today, it's important to note that we'll talk about how we came into this work. We'll share some examples of microaggressions and kind of the roots of microaggressions. And then we'll get into some different strategies to use to resist microaggressions, as well as provide some insight into what does this look like in a service learning and community engaged space as you're doing that work. Again, in getting to this point, we realized that we needed to connect to some of our university strategic goals around ethical and authentic partnerships, and kind of shape those for our own department, Service Learning Academy, and the partners that we were working with. And we knew we wanted to change the landscape that the work was happening in, as well as, again, meet some of our university goals connected to community engagement and being more asset-based, and then just addressing some of those frustrations within the climate related to that communication and relationships. And it's also important to note that we haven't always been in the know. We haven't always been as knowledgeable and employing some of these strategies. It really takes listening, understanding, and being in space to amass some resources, better understanding, and being in space with folks like you all to learn better, to learn how to be better. So I leave you with this quote from Dr. Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better. And that's really how we've gotten to the point that we're at, where we can learn, unlearn, grow, and share what we learn. So it's from our experience, and we think it's a great point to share with you all, is that when you're doing this work, it's really important to know the why of the work, and why it's important to your institution, to your community, and to you. And so at our institution, it's a metropolitan university, Carnegie Doctoral Research Institution, and the mission of the university is really to transform and improve the quality of life locally, nationally, and globally. And so below that, you'll see some of those strategic ways in which we do that across the institution. And so this is kind of our why. So one thing you can do as you're embarking on this work is to connect to your university goals that make sense in engaging in this space. So broadening that why means really thinking about who are the folks that are impacted through that work: the students, the folks on campus, the community partnerships. Nadal and collaborators found that while all microaggressions are harmful, microaggressions that occur in educational settings by professors and or other students, or work settings by employers or coworkers, may particularly hurt individuals' self-worth. Sue found that microaggressions negatively impact students' academic achievement and feelings of inclusion. And Nadal found that racial microaggressions were significantly correlated with depressive symptoms and negative effect. So the potential for damage is just too great, and the residual effects can be widespread and even more damaging. So the why, really understanding that why, is very critical in thinking about your stakeholders, the folks who are impacted the most. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Julie.
Great, thank you so much, Latrina. So in addition to thinking about our why, we're also thinking about what's running in the background of our work, what really frames how we show up. And in order to really identify those solutions, we specifically, those solutions that are specifically related to addressing and avoiding microaggressions in service learning and community engagement. We want to consider specifically how white supremacy culture contributes to power imbalance, to deficit thinking and implicit and explicit bias, and how that shapes our organizations. It shapes how we show up, and it shapes how we're really programmed to think. So there's some really great resources and trainings from the Racial Equity Institute that have really shaped how we think and we recognize this. When we are training our faculty members, which we do with our community partner organizations and our students about implicit bias in an effort to avoid microaggressions, we talk about how white supremacy culture contributes to this work and contributes to what's going on in the background. So that's really important to consider. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. So these are some of the ways in which the Racial Equity Institute frames how internalized white supremacy culture can show up. We do share this because we think it's important to acknowledge how we may be used to operating, and that can actually perpetuate white supremacy culture. So take, for example, right to comfort there. It's the last one on that final column. White supremacy culture specifically might show up in our classrooms and our community engagement experiences by centering the white experience and relieving discomfort for those in power and avoiding how or why marginalized folks and people of color experience discomfort. Examining these aspects of our culture makes us better to show up in our community engagement spaces authentically, and helps us to start to create a more multicultural climate and culture. Without acknowledging these things that exist, we can't move forward towards that goal of a more multicultural culture. It's really important to also note that these aspects, these cultural aspects of white supremacy, are damaging both to people of color and to white people by creating these environments. So I might offer that you take a second to consider how these show up with you, or how you engage with the community, or to kind of start searching if these are new to you. Take a look at these and kind of dig into a little bit more how what these different white supremacy culture components might look like. All right, next slide, please. So when we are doing our training, the message that we receive about white supremacy culture, or the messages that are constantly running in the background, those create implicit biases that we have. These unconscious biases, they can be favorable or unfavorable assessments, and they're really involuntary. It's a quick assessment, it's a quick judgment, something that happens in a reasonably unconscious manner. If you haven't already accessed resources that can help you or your campus understand implicit bias, we have a few from the Harvard online assessment, and we can drop those in the chat. We also have some materials available for you through the Oatmeal, has a kind of good way to think about how when you are experiencing like dissonant conversations, when folks are being challenged, how they might be able to approach this. So these are all tools that we use when we're teaching our campus and community and students and ourselves internally about implicit bias. So implicit bias characteristics. Next slide, please, Latrina. Those are, it's important to acknowledge that they are pervasive, that everyone has them. And so, it's okay to own the fact that you do have biases. It's an important part of how our brain functions. But it's important to also acknowledge that these are constructs, and they might not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or stance, and generally do favor our own in-group, okay? For example, one might have a bias against living in an urban environment, but work in that space and engage in that space in other ways. Or, and so consider the malleability of biases, and that our brains are really complex, and that these associations that we have formed we're able to change that. And so this is what we are training our faculty, staff, community partners, and students all the time about: acknowledging them, knowing that they're there, talking about, for example, white supremacy culture, talking about these biases so that we can name them and better understand them, especially because implicit biases do lead to microaggressions. And microaggressions are, as Sue has defined here for us, brief and commonplace. They're daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative insights or slights or insights. So it's important to acknowledge that it might feel, we use the word micro because it's perceived by the aggressor to be like just a no big deal. It's like, oh, whoops. But instead can have a very significant impact, a very large impact, much larger than micro impact on the individual for whom is experiencing the microaggression. And there's a lot of ways and types of microaggressions that this can come forward. So we have a couple of things defined here and citations there that you all can check out later, but micro assaults, right? So that is an overt discrimination, very intentional. Unfortunately, we have too many examples of these things showing up on our campus. A swastika on the wall of a classroom, a derogatory message left on a car of somebody in the parking lot. A micro insult. So this is something that where a statement the person is not accepted as a stereotype. So the student might be dismissed or treated as invisible. So for example, you're pretty for a Black woman. Wow, you speak really good English, right? And then a micro invalidation is a comment or action that dismisses the experiences of historically disadvantaged group members. For example, why do we have to talk about slavery? I don't see color, right? So these microaggressions are very corrosive. They are brought into learning environments on campus, off campus, and in the community. And as Latrina mentioned earlier, they do not create an environment, a learning environment that is positive, that can really provide an opportunity for us to be really deeply thinking about our work, transforming communities, transforming learning. And let's not forget that when folks are experiencing microaggressions, that idea of a death by 1,000 cuts, gosh, you know, every time you experience a microaggression, and if you have 5 of them by the time you have lunch that day or get out of your car, how difficult that creates a learning environment. So we feel like it's really, really important to consider how these things show up and name them. So as I transition, and Kirsten will take you through the next component of this, of our presentation today, we want you to be thinking about, you know, are there similar microaggressive behaviors occurring in your community engagement efforts? What type of microaggressions have you experienced in your role? And have you heard your partner share concerns? So just kind of take a moment to consider if these things are happening. And it also might be, these questions might be something to be used with your teams as well, so that you can start some dialogue about how this might look. I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten.
Thank you. So we've been talking a little bit about, you know, what's running in the background, as Julie shared, and so it's sort of in the air that we breathe. And so we're going to transition into the now what, because we really, you know, we know that these things are happening, but we need to have strategies to address them. And so we're going to be thinking about microresistance strategies and how they will, you know, how we can identify those opportunities within our service learning and community engaged work. So microresistance, it's small in scale. It can be individual or collaborative in its efforts. It's empowering the target or targeted people and allies, and to cope with and to respond to or to challenge microaggressions. And that ultimate goal is to dismantle systematic oppression. And so while we talk about microaggressions, there are these small indignities and slights that happen. Microresistance is the same, you know, result, right? It's the same strategy. It's the small things that we can do that build up into big change. And so as we think about that in a community engaged in service learning space, we're going to think about this using the IPARDE model. And so if we could go to the next slide. So we want to be able to use this as a framework because it helps us think about where implicit bias or microaggressions might show up in the work that we're doing. And so this is a great framework for us to use to do that. It's helpful because we'll be able to think about the experiences that will be occurring through each stage of this model and what might happen. So what are some of the things that we've heard in working with our stakeholders of microaggressions that have been happening? And then also to think about strategies that we can use to address them when they do occur. And following this piece, we are going to talk about some additional resources. So when you think like, okay, but what about when it's just between people, like this person, you know, and myself? What do I do? We'll talk about some of those opportunities as well. So before we move into that section, microaggressors can be students, faculty, or partners. Likewise, targets can be students, faculty, or partners. And so it kind of creates this complexity in the work that we're doing because we really want to make sure that we're all armed with this understanding and also these tools and resources so that we can address this. We know that implicit bias is always running in the background, which leads to this action of microaggressions. And so without these tools, we're just not prepared to deal with these situations. And then the other thing is, I mentioned that we are pulling examples from our experiences, but I really encourage you as we go through these stages to share examples of microaggressions that you have seen or experienced in the chat during these stages, and then also maybe additional strategies that you've seen that work within your community as well. So first we're going to talk about inventory and investigation, and of student interests and skills and talents, but also the analysis of the issue behind being addressed. And so this analysis could and will eventually require gathering information about the identified needs through the use of a variety of resources. And so this could be media, interviews, surveys, observations. But this stage is an important time to be thinking about that with your project and what will be necessary to incorporate to be able to address some of the perceptions about the community. So some examples that, again, that we've heard or seen of potential microaggressions during this stage are things like a faculty member saying, I can't go there, my husband says it's not safe about a particular neighborhood. Or we think we should just plant a garden to feed those poor people. Or do they even speak English? So these are some things that could occur during this time. And some of the ideas of solutions that we could explore are, number one, really entering this work with an asset-based lens. And so it's looking at listening to our partners and hearing what's going well within their space and the community that they represent and where they need support, not making assumptions about what they need and thinking that we have answers to our perceived needs. We also want to meet within the community as much as possible. I know right now we have some limitations to that, but when we can do it, it's important because it allows for some more balance in this power dynamic between our universities and also the community itself. So we're kind of taking away that assumption that maybe our time is more valuable, for example. And it also supports relationship building and a greater understanding of the community that we're working with. This is also a time to think about what you can build into the experience to help students understand their own privilege. So Julie shared the link to the Harvard Implicit Bias tool. That's a really great one. But this will provide a better understanding for all of us as we're entering this work when we think about the community that we're working with. And it's important to also be thinking about how we're going to educate our students about the history of the community that we're working with so that there's greater context for the work that we'll be doing, because a lot of our perceptions, implicit bias, is rooted in misconceptions, misinformation. So that's really important as well. So this is a good time also to be thinking about pre-reflection and the role that it can play in helping to prepare students for this. It's a great time to think about, for students to think about, what do I think I know about this issue, this community, this neighborhood, so that then they can start unraveling that with what they are learning and what they have experienced. So we transition from that into preparation and planning. So here we're focused on continuing to gather information and resources to help make this project successful. This includes academic content. Learning about the groups already working in this space is important because we don't want to be duplicating efforts. We want to be amplifying and supporting and strengthening efforts. And also making sure that we have really clear roles, responsibilities, and timelines in place. Some examples of microaggressions that could happen in this stage is things like, why are we still talking about slavery or women's rights or equality? Not making eye contact with community members or talking over community members as we have opportunities to engage with each other. And language like, why do we have to help them? This is not my problem. So when we think about solutions, some things that we can look at is positioning our community partners as co-educators. I tell students all the time that they are so lucky in this work because they have a campus educator and then they have community educators, and that they have a lot to learn within that space as well, so that they should engage with a learning mindset. Also, we can identify background information that students and or partners would need to know to be successful in this project. We can't assume what anybody knows, and so it's important for us to include this in the planning. So this could be pre-reading or research that would be incorporated into the coursework. Also, we want to use asset-based language, so we want to exclude things like help, for example, from how we talk about the work that we're doing, but also in how we write about the project in the syllabus, for example, or the projects on Canvas, for example. So we can think about terms such like collaboration or partnership in place of helping. Also, we want to provide context to students about service learning or the community engaged project and the role that students are playing. Students need to be able to make the connection between the coursework and what they're learning there and what it is that they're doing with and partnering with the community. And so it's really important that we're helping to make those connections for them. And lastly, getting it out into the community with your students. Again, we know that there's barriers with that, but there's really unique and innovative ways to still make these connections happen. But we want to provide as many opportunities as possible for students to learn about the history, culture, and assets of those that you'll be working with. So then we transition into action. And so we're focused on the implementation. This is where all the great work happens. This can look like direct service, indirect service, advocacy, philanthropy, or research. And this is where we're really focused on this reciprocity. So we want this to be mutually beneficial for students and for the community. Some things that we might see in microaggressions that we might see here is that students, I don't want that student working with me. I don't trust them. This could come from the community to students, right? So these things could be happening in any direction. Also, we've heard things like, this is where all the gang shootings happen, or wow, you speak English so well. Or faculty wanting students to see just how good they have it. So these are, like on all the other stages, pretty cringeworthy. And so we want to continue to dig deep into strategies to try to prevent these things from happening. So being on site with students when they are working within the community or partnering with the community is important because it allows you to help address microaggressions in the moment. But also recognizing that it's important to have that strong communication with our partners so they feel comfortable coming to you if something happens when we're not there with students. Also being able to have partners help facilitate with reflections throughout the process, because as co-educators in this process, again, they are well positioned to help us in helping to reframe students' perceptions about the community. So reflection is a key part of service learning, and I see it as this thread that's woven throughout. It helps connect the stages between the learning, classroom learning, and the service components. And so it allows students to consider their thoughts and feelings and experiences and reflect on this whole process as they are making greater connections to their own self-awareness of what they're learning and what is different about their new perceptions or new information that they're receiving. So we want to allow plenty of time and space for this reflection, for that type of learning to happen. Some things that could happen in this space is, I don't know what they would have done without us. You know, could be something that you would hear from a student. Or I think that they should just work harder for what they want. That is what I did. Right, and so these are some things that you could hear through maybe a class reflection or through a written essay, for example. So you want to help students build their own capacity to understand their own privilege and bias, but also we want to help build their capacity to address microaggressions as well. And so while we are trying to arm ourselves and build out our toolbox so that we're better equipped, we want to better equip our students in this space as well. So we can provide opportunities for students to reflect on their own privilege and implicit bias. The Harvard Implicit Bias Test is just one resource that might be helpful in helping students do that. And lastly, as we're thinking about wrapping up our projects and experiences, we're in that demonstration and an evaluation stage. And so we're providing students with an opportunity to demonstrate what they've learned and also to understand what they've accomplished, to really celebrate what they've accomplished through this project that they have completed. We're also evaluating the rigor and connection of what students have learned in the classroom and what they've learned from the experience. So additionally, it's important to remember that we want to also be debriefing with our community partners during this stage, because we should be in constant dialogue about what's going well, what's not going well, and how can we improve this process in the future. And so it's an important thing to remember. We like to see it throughout, but definitely we want to do that as we're concluding projects. So some of the things that you could see happening in this stage are students using negative perceptions in their presentations about the community as facts, or assumptions about things like parents don't come to these events anyway. So some strategies for this area could be, making sure that students have a clear understanding that statements need to be evidence-based, whether it's in written form or in their presentations. Helping students understand asset-based language, and so having that incorporated into the rubrics. Having students provide feedback to each other before final presentations so that they are helping each other identify where the asset-based language is showing up or maybe where it's not showing up. And then providing space and empowering community partners to be a part of this process, especially in the micro-resistance strategies. So these are just some examples. This is not all-inclusive. And so I haven't had a chance to really keep my eyes on the chat, but again, if there are some specific examples of microaggressions, maybe that you have seen in these stages that you would like to share, and or strategies that you've seen that have really worked, we would love to hear from you, because we know that every community is a little bit different, but also our experiences have some are also kind of common. And so we learn a lot from you as much as we hope that we can share with you. So all of this work has gone into this planning of this process so that we can try to plan for and prepare for where we know that there's going to be potential issues. But all of that work and a microaggression still happens. And so we wanted to share a couple of strategies that might be helpful when thinking about this. And this is a little bit more of that one-on-one, or maybe in a classroom setting or in a conversation. We're not going to dig deeply into this right now, but it is an example of some of the things that you could put in your toolbox. The one thing that we always recommend and try to remind people of is that this is about what works for you. And what works for me is a blend of a lot of different things, right? Also, when being in a position where you need to address and deal with a microaggression, you have a lot of things to consider. So time and place and setting. And so it's okay if something happens and you're driving home thinking about the 20 things that you wish you had done differently. Take the time to reflect and process and strategize on what you can do moving forward. So the 3 examples of some micro-resistance strategies here are take action, open the front door, and XYZ. So take action is looking at asking for clarifying questions to help you understand the intentions of the person that just spoke or was a part of some action, coming from a place of curiosity and not judgment. So we're assuming that this person didn't mean harm, so we want to give them that space. Telling others what you observed in a factual manner, and then also being clear about the impact. So of the impact on yourself or others. Own your own thoughts and feelings within this type of scenario, and requesting appropriate action that can be taken. This is one type that some people really like. And so again, blend it with things that work for you. The other one is open the front doors. So this is where you're observing what happened. This is what I saw happen. This is what I heard. This is what I witnessed. What you think about that. And so this could be either being the target or being in a supportive role for somebody that you've witnessed this microaggression. And then how did it make you feel? And what's your desired outcome? The last one is XYZ. So I feel X when Y because Z. There's no perfect strategy for any one situation, but the one that works for you. So we wanted to share these with you as some ideas, and combine those with the things that work for you as well. So this work that we've been talking about today has been a journey for us. We just want to show you really quickly the timeline of sort of like how we got here today. Know that this is an ongoing journey for us. So we are constantly learning and evolving in how we, how we do the work in this space. And so it's not done yet. And I think for anybody who's committed to this work, we're accepting that it's never really done. But as we close so that we can have a few moments for any questions that you have, we just wanted to share a few tips. One of them is just that this is going to feel uncomfortable. And honestly, when it feels uncomfortable, we're probably doing the right work, right? So if it's comfortable, we might not be pushing too deeply, right? And that's okay. It is the work. Discomfort invites us to explore, to get curious, and to grow. And so that's our goal. Challenging ourselves, pausing, reflecting, and really trying to look at things from all sides is really going to help us learn and grow in the work. Being vulnerable is important. And also just continuing to do our own work. So while we're in these positions of wanting to help facilitate this training and support for the other stakeholders around us, doing our own internal work is just as an important thing to do, and maybe a really good place to start if you haven't started that journey yet. So we are want to transition to just one last bit. So I'm going to invite you. I think we might have some technical challenges. So we would love for you to reflect on what you learned today, one thing that you could implement after today, and things that you're still curious about. If the chat function is working, please share some of those with us. It's really helpful for us to get a sense of where you're at and what you're taking away with you. But I'm going to turn to my colleagues in JR to check in on our question capacity here. So
I might go ahead, JR.
No, I was going to invite attendees, if you do have a question, be sure to drop those in the Q&A versus the chat box, because it's easier to manage the questions there and the experiences in the chat.
While we're waiting for some questions, I was kind of reflecting also on what Kirsten had been sharing and how maybe what we would do the same and maybe things that we would maybe do differently as we've been offering these things since 2018 and how we've kind of developed over time. So one of the things that I think, a couple of things I think we did right at from the very beginning was to include our partners. We were training both our faculty members and our community partners and our students, if they were interested, all together. And we found that this was really, really important because it wasn't as if we were treating our faculty different than our partners. And it turned out our partners were really thirsty for this kind of conversation. They knew it was happening in their organizations, and they also wanted to bring other folks in to have these conversations, even with outside of the community engagement context. So I think that was one of the things that was really effective. I also think it was really effective that we have modules that Kirsten and our graduate students would go into classes and talk with students about implicit bias. And so that's a kind of a service that we would provide for folks that were interested in this. We also include it in our trainings that are just for faculty members so that they're aware of these types of conversations about implicit bias. We require them to go through that kind of conversation, and then they're able to use those tools to help their students to go through that. So those are things I think that we that have been really effective at the beginning. Things that I would do differently that we have changed since the beginning of offering these types of opportunities and trainings for our faculty and community partners is to very consistently offer these sessions. So we just started offering them each semester, and we have it broken out from a 101 type of an experience to a 201 type of an experience, so that we can start talking about and acknowledging bias and exploring that and practicing our micro-resistance strategies. But then we also, the next part of that is to apply it to community engagement sessions or community engagement and service learning courses. And so that's one of the things, those are some of the things that we've been doing to differentiate beginners from secondary or from more novice folks.
There is a question that's come in. Are you tracking changes over time? Have you noticed differences in outcomes since the start of offering these courses?
I can start answering that again, and then my colleagues can. So we are starting to do that research. Thank you for that question. Yes, we are starting to do that. We have some initial assessments, but we really want to track and see how folks are using this. It went away.
Oh.
Does somebody else have the rest of that question? Sorry, I lost it.
Are you tracking changes over time? Have you noticed differences in outcomes? I would just add to that it gives me so much joy when working with faculty that have begun to incorporate tools and resources that we've shared through the training. And so whether it's inviting us into their classroom to provide those lectures around implicit bias and microaggressions, to asking for recordings that they could post into their class to make available to everybody, to using specific tools like maybe the implicit bias assessment. That means that those things are resonating for them and that they see value in it. I think the big thing is helping faculty in all disciplines understand why this matters in their space. So a mathematician or somebody in IT innovation or whatever it may be, marketing could say, well, but this is nice, this is important, but, why my class? And the reality is that we know that this impacts all fields and the decisions that are being made within those fields. And so giving students a chance to really dig into these themes while they're in the classroom in a learning space is so important. So, to add on to, we're working on the research aspect. The big thing is we're seeing faculty using it. And so, and really trying to respond to what they're asking from us next.
Another question has come in. Are you willing to share the curriculum or outline for the community workshops you mentioned?
We absolutely have this presentation that we're, I know this webinar folks are able to share, or the outline for the community workshops. Go ahead and give us a call, drop us an email, and we're happy to talk about this. We do have the opportunity to do and help facilitate some of these pieces if folks are interested as well. So contact us, and we're happy to talk through some of those opportunities with you. I did want to acknowledge our colleague, Latrina, if you wanted to add anything else to what we've been talking about up to this point, if you're able. I think maybe not.
Yeah, she might be frozen.
Well, I wanted to also mention that when, just like anything, when you're having these conversations and you're using words like, you're talking about white supremacy culture, you're talking about implicit biases, it's started to become more of our language at UNO and how we're thinking about community engagement, not only with faculty and students, but also with partners. And so it's not a scary thing as much as, folks might feel anxious. So you have to start somewhere. And so I feel like there's a little bit of what we call in our office, a little bit of muscle memory built up so that we're not starting, doing crunches right now. We've done the crunches. We're ready to kind of build the muscles out a little bit more in our work.
I have a question. If there aren't any more right now in the Q&A chat, I loved how you started your session framing this around white supremacy culture. And I think about how higher education is built so much on white supremacy culture, just with the structures that we have in place for promotion and tenure, et cetera. So can you talk a bit about has your work or workshops in any way translated to working with senior administrators or board of trustees? Because in some ways I think about, with the community aspect aside, within the walls of higher education, how do you push back as mid-level faculty, mid-career faculty, or mid-level administrators when maybe senior administrators or board of trustees aren't so willing to acknowledge or change?
Hear me now?
Go ahead, Latrina.
Okay. I think Julie could probably answer this question better than me because she's in a lot of those spaces with those senior folks. However, I would just add that I think we've all seen a shift in the past year or so in many spaces, but definitely in higher education, of almost a renewed sense of urgency in becoming a more anti-racist organization, and also a renewed interest in exploring racism and what it looks like on different levels, and just kind of holding up a mirror and taking a look at ourselves. And so our institution is, like other institutions, has been exploring that and kind of deepening its interest in that, and not only the interest, but starting to do a little more deeper work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but also like opening up really difficult conversations, and even in some cases putting a little money behind it, the words, and saying, okay, if we're going to do this work, let's incorporate the community into this, and let's talk about what this can look like in a very strategic way, and in a way that demonstrates a deeper investment than just putting the work on one faculty member in one classroom or one unit doing the work on their own. So that has really, I think, helped in terms of having these larger conversations and kind of deepening our work, because we know we're connecting to our institution's goals and work as well.
Well said.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes. If there's one more question, if anyone has one. You know, I certainly have more I want to ask, but I don't want to take away from our attendees. I'll jump in with one last question. Can you talk about visual microaggressions? That's one piece I didn't see in the presentation, and I'm curious if that's come up in your research or your work.
So, you know, visual, institutional, structural microaggressions occur daily, especially in a predominantly white institution where, you know, leadership, you know, is all male, all white. So that happens all the time, and that's something that we point out and we mention, and especially when we're talking about searches and how we can make sure that we are addressing bias in searches, doing the essential steps to make sure that we have a diverse pool, and are critical about how we're getting there. That's internally some of the things that we're thinking about. Other folks might have some ideas on that too.
I would just underline what she said.
Perfect. Any last thoughts or words for our attendees?
I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here. This is not easy work. It is necessary work, but we choose to do it. And so I think that remembering that this is the journey, that it is messy, it is not always easy. And at the end of the day, the goal is not perfection. The goal is to be in the work. And so I hope that that you continue your journey. And we're here to serve as a resource or a collaborator if and when you may need us.
And there was a last question that came in just quickly. Are your courses available as online coursework? Is it available to educators doing this work that are not enrolled in your university?
We did do some online sessions, and so having folks talk to us about maybe trying to get piped into something, or we can work with other folks to kind of get connected. But yeah, the sessions that we have done, we've been able to translate online so that we can meet folks where they are and continue the momentum.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for their session today and for being a part of the Campus Compact webinar series. To our attendees, there was a small glitch that we're unsure what happened in the beginning, where some folks joined later, others were able to join right away. But we do assure you that the entire session was recorded, and you will receive a link after today's session so that you have full access to watch at your own convenience. So thank you all for joining us. Check out future opportunities through Campus Compact at compact.org.
Thanks, JR.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Folks are trickling off.
Is it still happening?
Well, it's folks are leaving, so they're exiting out of here. We're not sure what the glitch was in the back end. About halfway through, all of a sudden, like almost 20 more people joined. So
Oh, wow.
Madasal is looking into it.
It looks like there's one more question.
Yes, one more question.
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
She's
So
Latrina, sounds like you have an email from
should I reach
Tawana.
out? Should I reach out? Have you already reached out to Latrina? So maybe she.
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, Tawana.
Good.
I don't see that. Where do you see that? Oh, is that in the
Under the
Q&A?
questions.
Yes, I have a plan to email you back if you're still there. So we can definitely talk about your other question.
I'm not sure if she can be unmuted or not. No? Okay. Yeah, it sounds like we'll have to connect offline, so.
All right, well, thank you all so much.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much. Thanks for your questions.
Yes, for sure, they were great answers. So I don't know, I was jotting down notes. I had more, but. All right,
Okay.
well, thanks again. See you later.
Bye.
Thanks, JR. Bye-bye.
Bye.